Now, the African continent will fall far behind in achieving the Millennium Development Goals by 2030. And that's, of course, thanks to the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. This is according to scenario planner and futurist Marius Oosthuizen. Also, non-COVID-19 related mortalities are expected to increase as the focus shifts towards controlling the pandemic. The current conditions paint a bleak picture for Africa's poor, especially, most of whom will be worse off on the other side of this crisis. Let's unpack this issue further now. Marius Oosthuizen joins us on the line, in fact, via our video line. Good morning, Marius. Thanks very much for your time here on the AM Report. I think perhaps the issue, the topic of this interview is possibly the biggest issue that ordinary people around the world face, this issue of planning for the future. In your job as a scenario planner, how has COVID-19 made that especially difficult?
Well, good morning and good morning to your viewers. Of course, the pandemic, in many people's books, was a complete unexpected event. In scenario planning terms, we sometimes refer to those as wildcard events. But there were experts and medical practitioners that were warning that pandemics were possible. And so I guess from a planning point of view, what we want to do is we want to plan in a way that prepares us for these kinds of unexpected events. We want to draw on those experts to say, what are the future alternatives we have? In Africa's context, we were affected very severely by a pandemic not originating in Africa, coming from Asia essentially, having a global economic impact, and we're now seeing the fallout of that.
Marius, I want us to start small and start with individuals and how they embark on their own version of scenario planning, of being a futurist, of their own futures, predicting what's to come. Some people finding it really impossible. What are some of the tools that you use as a scenario planner that I might be able to apply to my everyday life?
Well, I think there are two key questions we need to ask. The first is, what are the key uncertainties that we're facing? Planners typically want to work with certainty. They want to know what the future holds. They want to be certain about that and make decisions based on certainty. As scenario planners, we accept that there is uncertainty. And so once we identify the key uncertainties, and so if you're a person in the services sector and you're facing a downturn in the sector, for instance, you might say, well, there's a key uncertainty around the growth in the sector and the impact that that's going to have on my career, on my job, on my options. And once you've identified those key uncertainties, the second question is, what are my strategic options? We live in a world that's not entirely outside of our control. We do have a measure of agency to bring to bear on the environment around us. And so by identifying the key uncertainties and identifying our strategic options, we're able to produce a strategy that's not only determined by a preferred future or an ideal future, but is resilient across multiple alternative future possibilities. As a country at the moment, as South Africa, we're faced with that, where we have to think about the uncertainties facing our economy, the uncertainties facing the global economy, and we have to think about our strategic options and formulate a set of responses that are resilient, adaptive, that can put us in a good position in spite of the uncertainty around us.
Marius, I'm glad you're talking about resilience, because that surely is a key feature of surviving an uncertain future. And as a country, as you say, the poor in South Africa, around the world, the worst affected by COVID-19, by the situations brought on by a pandemic, the economy, a lack of jobs, a lack of basic infrastructure at our homes with running water and sanitation. In terms of resilience, how would you rate South Africa as the government, how it's performed so far, 102 days into the lockdown?
Well, we've seen an interesting phenomenon on the continent where, when the pandemic began, African governments were, on the whole, fairly prompt in their response. They reacted quite early to the pandemic and had quite aggressive measures. And South Africa's government, of course, was among those that very early on instituted a lockdown. We do think, our analysis says at least, that the early lockdown in South Africa certainly delayed that increase in the curve, as we say, and probably averted what we would call a perfect storm in epidemiological terms, a very high infection rate that overwhelms the health system. Having said that, just like other governments across Africa, the formulation of policy is one thing, the implementation of policy is quite another. And so as we moved into the lockdown, we began to see weaknesses in our institutions. We began to see the inability of government to deliver food parcels to vulnerable communities. in many instances, even the inability to know, or the absence of data about the real state of certain communities and understanding what the needs are in those communities. Now, when we take those lessons into the future, it's very likely that our government's going to formulate wonderfully grand plans in response to the current challenge of the economy not growing and unemployment. The question is, will it have the capacity as an institution? Will it have the resilience with its partners to form the kind of social compacts the country is going to need to get us out of the malaise? And we're slightly worried about that at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you're touching on an important point, unemployment. Pre-COVID-19, our numbers were already dismal, 28% and upwards, half of those young people without a job. Post-COVID-19, some projections putting it at 50% unemployment in South Africa. Again, the bulk of that being young people. After the lockdown is lifted here at home and on the continent, how do countries then begin to recover from that kind of knock to the economy that sees more than half of young people who are able to work without a job?
Well, it's a great question. I think that South Africa is really facing a triple challenge. The first is the health challenge of the pandemic. The second is the economic challenge, which in fact pre-existed COVID, where South Africa was increasingly stagnant, investment was stalling, business confidence was at a multi-decade low. And then, of course, on top of that, we have a fiscal crisis where our debt levels have spiraled. We haven't been prudent with how we spend our money as a country and our public finance. And so the question of how do we get out of this, the reality is we cannot budget our way out of this. There's lots of pressure on Minister Tito Mboweni, but the solution is not going to come from the budget. We also can't imagine our way out of this with some kind of illusion of government-led stimulus, because we simply don't have the resources to do that. And so we have to accept that South Africa has to stimulate its economy, not only from the side of government, but also from the side of the private sector. We have to take a step back as South Africans and say, what is the economy we want in 50 years' time? And what are the moves we need to make, the investments we need to make now in infrastructure, in human capital, in small business development to unlock that economy? If we have a 50% unemployment, what that means is that 50% of the population cannot be absorbed by the current economy. So we have to double the economy in the very least in order to absorb those people. That's not going to happen with a Tito budget. That's going to happen with large-scale societal engagement, such as we've seen in South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia is doing it, Japan has done that over the years. And so we really need to take a serious look at ourselves and say, what kind of economic future do we want for the country, and how do we create it?
Marius, just very, very quickly before we let you go, are these the kinds of discussions that government is having with people like you, with futurists like yourself?
So I can say that government does use foresight and scenario planning widely. It's done so in Treasury, it does so even at Eskom, it does so in the Department of Public Works and other places in the state. The question is not really whether government can see what the future ought to be, but when it leaves the room, when it leaves the planning discussion and it gets into a conversation with stakeholders, like the unions, like business, is it putting its foot to where it wants to go? Yeah. Is it acting on its decisions? We see that with SAA. And so really it's about execution rather than planning, I think, is where the challenge is.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for your time. Marius Oosthuizen joining us there via our Skype line. He is a scenario planner and futurist. Some interesting discussions there on a country level that perhaps we can apply to our own lives as individuals.